The United Nations witnessed a public showdown on Monday between Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin, who both outlined sharply different views about how to end the civil war in Syria. The two presidents delivered dueling speeches that effectively blamed each other for the violence that continues to devastate Syria more than 4 years after the civil war began. Later in the day, they held a 90-minute meeting that both sides described as frank, but which did not resolve their fundamental differences over the Syrian conflict. In his speech, Mr. Obama denounced Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian leader, as a tyrant who dropped barrel bombs on innocent children, and said he could not be part of Syria's long-term future, although he did allow that Mr. Assad could be part of a managed transition to a new leader.
But we must recognize that there cannot be, after so much bloodshed, so much carnage, a return to the pre-war status quo.
Mr. Putin, on the other hand, called on the West to support the Assad regime in its fight against Islamist terrorists. Assad's forces, he said, were the only ones really fighting ISIS in Syria.
We think it's an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces, who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurdish militia are truly fighting Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria.
In effect, America sees Assad as the root of the problem, Russia sees him as the solution. But what was striking about the speeches was not just the entrenched positions on Syria, which are now widely known, but the way that both presidents seemed to aim a large part of their remarks at each other. In what appeared to be a reference to the Russian leader, Mr. Obama warned about dangerous currents that risk pulling us back into a darker and more disordered world. Mr. Putin slammed what he called the self-conceit and exceptionality of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Given the arguments over the last 2 years about Ukraine and Syria, it's become almost a cliche to mention the Cold War echoes now that exist between the US and Russia. But this was the kind of verbal sparring between Washington and Moscow that the UN really has not seen since the end of the Cold War. This is Jeff Dyer for the Financial Times reporting from New York.